This is the warm-up for this one. You guys are gonna figure out which of these does not belong and why. There are multiple answers. You could have the same answer as someone else, a different answer. It's okay. There are multiple answers. So I'm gonna give you a few minutes to think about which of these does not belong and why. And then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, what do we think? Which one doesn't belong and why?
So E because it's not in what equals or it's in standard form. You don't need to write these down, I'm just writing them down so we all see. Any others? All of these could not belong for a different reason. There are obvious reasons, and there are some we have to manipulate or solve for. What's an obvious reason A would not belong? Okay, just by looking at it, it's the only one with a fraction. What about P? What is the obvious reason why it wouldn't belong?
It's correct.
It's a graph. The only one that's graph. What about C? What would be the obvious reason why it doesn't belong? How is this different than this, this, and this? Just by looking at it. D is the obvious because of the standard form. A, we could have also said it's the only one in slope intercept form. Now, if we actually found the equation for each, so let's do that. This one's already in slope intercept form. What would the equation of this line be? What would that slope be? What would that y-intercept be? It's negative, so negative 2x minus 1. For C, you could either use two of the points to do your slope intercept form. You could have plotted these into decimals into your calculator. You could also just see, since we know our slope is the change in y or the change in x, I can see my y's are going up by 2 each time. And my x's are going down by 3 each. So my slope is going to be negative 2/3. My y-intercept is given. Did anyone solve D? So yeah. This one is y equals negative 1/2 x plus 2. Now, if we're looking at all of the equations, which one doesn't belong and why? Russell, did you do that one? Sure. Why? Here, all the other y-intercepts are -1. D is the only one that has a y-intercept of 2. Any others? Ashley, are you raising them? By B.
the only one without a fraction, and the slope will technically it is a fraction, but right now it's also a. Any others? If I said there's something with A's equation that can make this not belong, what would that be? Only one without a two in it. And the slope or the y-intercept, but mainly the slope. All the other ones have two in it somewhere. This one does not have it at all. So you could have answered any of these for a number of different reasons, obvious or solving them and looking at the equation. There we go. We finished the first two pages, right? We're gonna go on to this page. Does anyone need another one of those? So with these, we're going to graph these and describe the transformations. We'll graph the first ones and then describe, and then we'll describe and graph the later. If you would like rulers, you're welcome to grab it out of the bin. Before I graph this, I'm gonna graph the original. You can graph this, you don't have to graph this, just so you can compare. Remember that the original is y equals x. So it's gonna start at the origin and go up one, right one, as many times as possible. And down one, left one, as many times as possible. If we were to draw in this new graph, gonna start at -5. The slope is +6/1, so we can go up 6 into the right one. If we do it again, we'll be off the graph. You can do that or leave it. So if we were comparing this new line, the blue line, to the original, what changed? What happened? About your transformation words from these notes, you can flip back if you need to. No. Y-intercept shifted down 5. What else happened?
Slope is steeper by 6.
Or 6 times as steep, either or. Questions on those two descriptions? For number 2. If I were to graph this one, this happens to be the original. So start in the middle, up one, right one. And then down one, left one. So since this line is the original, did anything change? No. So you would say the slope and the y-intercept stayed the same. We're gonna skip 3 and 4 and try 5 and 6. Now, these are not in slope intercept form. So we'll need to get them in slope intercept form first by doing what? Subtract x on both sides. We have 2y equals negative x plus 8. And then to get y by itself. So our new equation, y equals negative 1/2 x plus 4. Now, if we're comparing this to the original, we'll do this, do the describing before we graph it. What changed? Y-intercept shifted up back to where it was 0, now it's positive 4. What else changed? Now, is this steeper? Is this a fraction? Less steep by 1/2. Or 1/2 times the steep. Something else happened. Slope was reflected. Because of that negative, we have to do that as well. Okay. Now that we know all those things, we can graph this line. Start at positive 4. And it's negative, so we can go up and left. Up 1, left 2 as many times as possible, or down 1 and right 2 as many times as possible. Let's do the same thing for number 6. How would we get that back in slope intercept form? So subtracting the y would give you more work. You do it that way, but there's an easier thing, something easier to do. Okay. Subtract the 7x. So we have y equals negative 7x plus 5. If you had subtracted y, you'd have had to then subtract 5 and then divide both sides by -1. So you could have done it that way. It just may give you more steps.
Right, let's compare the original to this new one, what changed?
So you mixed up the words there. If we're talking about shifted, is that slope or is that y-intercept?
Oh, right.
The y-intercept shifted up. What else? Is this less steep? So the negative and the 7 have nothing to do with each other. Would the 7 make this less steep or steeper? So steeper by 7, 7 times the steep. What about the negative? Question. So and then now that we have our descriptions, let's graph this. Y-intercept at +5, slope is -7, so we can go down 7 and to the right 1. We only have room for those 2 points. Would you look on the back? Let's see if we have questions on either of those 2. If we don't have questions, I want you to just be careful because the graphs are numbered by 2 instead of by 1. So we are going to switch gears to go through review questions for your quiz on Wednesday, your test on Friday. Yeah. Okay, so we can do this by objective or by page. Which would we prefer? Objective or page? Go in. So if we're doing it by objective, on the first page, first objective is slope. So numbers 1 through 9 all deal with slope. What questions do we have on any of those? Yes. I'll circle all of them and then go over. Is it 5?
and others in 1 through 9 aren't. I think that's a good start. If we have other questions, we will go back to this. So with number 4, we need to first remember our slope our slope formula. So I'm gonna write that off to the side. Y2 minus Y1 over X2 minus X1. And then label these if you need to. X1, Y1, X2, Y2. Right, just in case you can't read the fractions, that says 1/4, -3/4, -1/2, and 5/6. We're gonna put that into that formula. 5/6 minus -3/4 all over -1/2 minus 1/4. Before we combine these fractions, we need to get common denominators. So for the numerator fractions, think of a number that 6 and 4 both go into. So we could multiply 6 by 2 to get 12. They would both go into 12. So multiply both the numerator and denominator of this fraction by 2, and multiply both of these by 3. In the denominator, these could both be 4 by multiplying just the one fraction by 2. So that our new fractions would be 10/12 plus, because of the negative and the positive, or the negative and the minus, 9/12 all over -2/4 minus 1/4. And then we could combine the fractions just by simplifying the numerators. We have 19/12 over -3/4. All of this work needs to be shown by hand, but this last step can either be done in the calculator or by hand. By hand, you would take the bottom, the denominator fraction, flip it, and multiply to both pieces. You get -19/9. Or you could put it into the calculator, but you have to do exactly as I do. Alpha y equals. Do it again. Go all the way to the bottom and do it again. And then put in your fraction. If you don't put it in exactly like that, you will not get -19/9. Question on that? Number 5 is similar but not in fraction form. I'm gonna label these, you don't need to do this, but if it helps you do that. So -2 minus 7 over -11 minus -11. Subtract across. So we get -9 over, what would this become? The final answer is with this part. 0. So here you get something over 0, which is undefined. If you're not sure whether this is 0 or undefined, put this in the calculator. It's either going to give you 0 or error. Error is undefined. Questions on that one? Okay. Number 7, this is already in slope intercept form. We just have to figure out what is the M and what is the B. So in this case, what is your slope? -3, not the x bar, just the number. What's your y-intercept? Not 1. 0. There's nothing there, so that would be 0. Now 8 is similar, but we have to solve it first. So to solve this, we would have to get rid of the 2x by subtracting. And divide everything by 5. Once we have our equation, now we can say what our m and what our b is. What is the slope of this equation? -2/5. What is the y-intercept? Positive. Other questions in 1 through 9? Okay, you guys are doing this. So in number 3, in 1 through 3, you're looking for the slope from the graph. But for 2 and 3, you have to remember your Hoyle-Butz. If number 3 is a vertical line, what type of slope is it going to have? Undefined. If you don't remember your Hoyle-Butz, these may become difficult. And then number 9, same as number 8, solve this one, get rid of the x. And divide everything by -2. And then you can identify your slope and y-intercept. What would your slope be? Half, and your y-intercept? Not the back of this page, but the next page has more slope questions. Numbers 1 through 6 are all slope questions on this page. If we want to see you go over any of those.
Oh,
On this page. I'm going to highlight these and see first language. Trying to fix it. So for number 1 is asking which of these lines have a slope of 3/4. Well, it can't be A or D, so it has to be B or C. So we just need to find the slope of these lines. So find points that cross the grid lines exactly. And see which of these is 3/4. So would that be B or would it? B, if I'm going from this point to this point, I'm going up 4 to the right 3, which would be 4/3, not 3/4. So it has to be. I'm sorry, I said D, but I meant B and C. My bad. C was the correct. For the undefined, that's gonna be one of your horizontal or vertical lines, A or D. Which of those has an undefined slope? Okay. Think about your hooks. Vertical lines, supposed to be a V. Have undefined. Other questions on this page? If one of those. If you do 6, pick one of those. That's it. Okay, so for number 4, still using your point, your slope formula. This would be x1, y1, x2, y2. If we did the slope of this line, it'd be -2 minus -2 all over 3 minus 13. And then we could simplify. We get 0 over -10, which would be which of these answers? 0. For number 6, if we need an equation that has a slope of 1/4 and a y-intercept of -2, we know at the end it's supposed to look something like y equals 1/4 x minus 2. None of these are in slope intercept form. if this would help you, I would say look at just solving for the y-intercept. Just looking at this part to see would that help, but these all will give you negatives. So you would have to pick one and solve it to see if we could maybe eliminate. So like if I pick C and I started to solve it, I got rid of 4x by subtracting. I can see that the slope is opposite of what we're supposed to have. So it's not gonna be C. D set up similarly, so it's not gonna be that one either. It has to be A or B. So again, we would need to solve one of these. Let's say I solve A. We have negative 4y equals negative x plus 8. And divide everything by negative 4. So we have y equals positive 1/4 x minus 2, which matches, so that would be our.
If it didn't match, B would automatically be B.
Not the back of this page, but the next page. There's only one question that's slope related, and that's 15. Questions on that one? Let's go back to the beginning. Now we're doing intercepts. So on the first page, 10 and 11 are intercept questions. Do we have questions on either of them? Zeros is another word for what? Which intercept, x or y?
A 50-50 chance. Yes.
So when you see the word zeros, you're talking about x-intercepts. There are two other words for x-intercepts. Does anyone remember what they are? So x-intercepts are zeros and two other things. Solutions and roots. So keep that in mind. If you see any of those words, x-intercepts, zeros, solutions, or roots, they're all talking about the same thing, finding the x-intercept. So in this case, we just have to plot the x-intercepts, plot points at the x-intercepts. Now, if it said plot the intercepts, that would be your x and y, you would need to label which ones are which. But since this is just zeros, they're just all x-intercepts. On the back of that page, numbers 14, 15, 18, and 19. Yeah. I'm gonna rewrite this so you can see it first. F of x equals x to the fourth minus 8x to the third plus 5x squared plus 14 is what that means. And then in our calculator, we're going to do this part. So in the calculator, we're gonna go into y equals. Clear out whatever is there.
unless it happens to be that same equation.
And then we're gonna type in x, the variable first, raised to the fourth power. I'm gonna use this little hat here, but whatever, above the division sign. Come out of that, minus 8x to the third. Come out of that, plus 5x squared, plus 14x. Once you have all of that in your y equals, you're gonna graph. And you should be able to see where this goes through your x-intercept. So at these 4 points, 0, -1, 2, and 7. And we would write those as ordered pairs. Any others from that page, 14, 15, or 18? I'm gonna rewrite so you can see what it says. X equals 8x minus. So again, if we're finding the 0, we're looking for the x-intercept. When we're finding this algebraic, we have to remember that the y value, we're looking for an x-intercept, is what? For this question. What is the y value if we're looking for an x-intercept? So you also have to remember that f of x is the same as y, so you can change this to y. Or you can just change the f of x or y to 0. And then you're just solving for x. Add 16 to both sides. Divide both sides by 8. And then you would still have to write it as ordered. If it were asking for intercepts in general, you wouldn't have to do the work to find the y because it's given to y-intercept would be -16. And then not the next page or the back of that page, but the page that starts off like this. Numbers 11 through 13 and 16 and 17 are all intercept questions. Questions on any of those? Mhm. 17 and 11. For 11, same as the problem we just did, we're gonna put 0 in for one of the variables and solve for the other one. Does not matter which one first. So let's say I'm solving for x. I would put 0 in for y. And then you can skip making this 0 and bringing it down. You can skip to what would be left. Solve for x. And you would write this as an ordered pair. -2, 0. And then you would do the same thing to find y. Put 0 in for x. Bring down for y equals -20, divide both sides by 3. And write that as an ordered pair. 0, -5.
Do you have any questions on that one?
Seventeen is another calculator one. So we can put this into our calculator. Back in y equals. Clear out whatever is there. And put x to the third. Plus 3x squared. Minus x minus 3. And then graph this. It's asking which is not a 0. So again, we're looking for x-intercepts. The ones that are x-intercepts are -1, -3, and 1. So which one is not? Any other questions on that page? 12, 13, or 16? The function. This is your function for your equation. We just look at the equation. Same. Okay. Let's go to the back of the first page. Now we're in graphing. Some of these are actual graphics and some of them are already graphed and you have to find the equation. The numbers 12 and 13 are both graphing types. We have questions on either of those. For 13, we can eliminate some of these by looking at the y-intercept. Y-intercept has to be a -1. If we're looking at other points, at the end, our equation has to be y equals 5/3 x minus 1. To eliminate some of these, if we were solving for y and we put 0 in for x, and we just solve this part, would this give me a -1? I'm not gonna be. Would this one give me a -1? Yes. So it could be D. Would C give me a -1? No. Would D give me a -1? So either B or D, so we've eliminated two of them. Now we just need to solve them and see does it look like this or not. So subtract 3x. And divide everything by -5. This would be a positive 3/5 x minus 1. So we have the -1, but the slope is split, so it's not b and it would have to be b. You could solve that too. But it's not necessary since we eliminated everything else. And then not the next page, but the back of the next page. Questions 7 through 10, any of those we have questions on? Or on the next page, number 14. Question on that before we go on to our last agenda. We're just looking at the graph. But you were talking about 10 on the last. It's very much like the one we just did. If we had to find the x and y intercept, so this, the last one, the x-intercept would have been a fraction. This one will also be a fraction, so maybe just x. So we know our x-intercept or our y-intercept is going to be a positive 2. Looking at these, that doesn't really help us eliminate any of these. So we have to figure out what our slope is. And figure out which of these equations would give us that. So y equals 3/4 x plus 2 is what we're looking for. If I pick one to start solving for, so let's say A, and I got rid of 4x, and I went to divide everything by 3. You have a negative slope, and the slope is flipped, but the y-intercept matters. So now in this format where x is, the coefficient of x is 4, it's not going to be A or B. I also know that if both of these are positive, one of these is going to end up a negative, so it couldn't be C. So it have to be D, and we can solve that to confirm. Go to the very last one. These are all your linear transformation questions. Which of these do we want to see do go over some questions? For number 5,
It tells us we have sum f of x equals x, that's the original drawing. We need to plot 2 points. It says to create a line, but we're not actually creating a line, we're just plotting 2 points. That's been shifted down 2 units and 3 times the speed. So if our original y-intercept is at 0 and it's been shifted down 2 units, where's our new y-intercept? -2 on the y-axis. And then if it's 3 times as steep, what is our new slope? 3/1. So in one of the directions, go up 3 to the right 1, down 3 to the left 1. Doesn't matter where, you just need 2 points. That's other questions on this page? For the remainder of the class, you guys have these 3 options. 3.5, 4, whatever. You can keep working through the review, go through it, come ask me whatever questions you have. You could go back to your graphing notes to practice the linear transformations, exactly what we were doing at the beginning of class. You can be working on Delta Math / linear transformations activity if you have not, since those were all due on Friday, they are all now missing. So if you do any of those, you have to email me. Or if you would like to work on retake work and use this time for retake work, you have to study on your own time, but you could come see me to do that work as well. So review or work on the graphing notes, but doing linear transformations, Delta Math and linear transformations activity, or retake work. Come see me with any questions you have. Come see me if you need to do retake work. Use this time wisely. You can use Desmos, your calculator, your notes, each other.